Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur, and this is the final week of this course. In this week, I am going to talk to you about some of the miscellaneous topics about bilingualism and multilingualism and cover a bunch of things that we've not already covered before. We've talked so far about acquisition of bilingualism, multilingualism, usage of bilingualism, multilingualism. We've talked about cognitive consequences. We've talked about control issues. We've talked about many different things. But in this week, I will try to basically talk about aspects that talk about how bilingualism touches our lives in different ways, what kind of social and practical consequences it may have for bi and multilinguals. Let's go ahead. Now, while the phenomena of bilingualism is itself intriguing, it is fascinating that it has become more of a norm than an exception in the past few decades. Where anywhere across the world, if you go, and more so in India, it is fascinating that bilingualism and multilingual individuals basically, everybody knows more than one language, and their knowledge of more than one language actually affects different areas of their life. For example, their communicative efficiency, their academic achievement, their ability to learn to read and write, their job prospects, and so many other things. So in this last series of lectures, I will actually focus on some of these interesting aspects of how bi or multilingualism may actually affect different walks of our lives, and we'll try and understand or explain the same. Now, it is fascinating that a large proportion of students in the world, and especially in India, actually enter a school without speaking the language of the instruction. And this is interesting because while there are obviously regional language schools in all parts of India, say for example, there are Hindi medium schools in UP, there are Tamil medium schools in Tamil Nadu, Marathi medium schools in Maharashtra. But a large proportion of school-going students actually attend school, which follows a medium of instruction that is not their native language. Basically, a lot of us attend English medium schools. English is the second language that we learn probably first in school and then later, because almost all of us English is not spoken at home as much as our native language. So although students sort of cope up with this, and they do well for the most part, the instruction and education in second language has consequences for literacy, and it is interesting that this is one of the aspects in bilingualism that has been rather understudied. And moreover, researchers from different fields of inquiry, be it language acquisition, cognitive development, and education, and have basically developed their explanatory models about various phenomena in their fields, with the underlying assumption that children have a single mind that deals with a single conceptual system with a single language. Now, it is interesting, while bilingualism and multilingualism has actually become a norm, and everybody almost, you look around, speaks at least two, if not more, languages, the theoretical explanations of the phenomena, psychological phenomena and individuals actually go with the assumption, a slightly simplified assumption, that people have a single unitary conceptual system and they basically interact with it using a single language. So it is therefore not difficult to see the fault in this approach if one were to observe the effects of interaction between language and thought, and that would probably apply to all aspects of cognition. Now, moving on, interestingly, although the potential impact of language on all aspects of cognition should be obvious, most early theorists, for example, Jean Piaget, who was one of the most preeminent developmental psychologists, has essentially ignored the role of language while theorizing about aspects like cognitive development. Interestingly, even Noam Chomsky who is one of the greatest linguists of our time, has postulated a view of language where basically talks about language as a self-encapsulated module which does not interact or impact other cognitive processes. Now, these views have basically contributed in, having a very separate and having a very fractured, if I may use the word, view of language and cognition, and has made it difficult for researchers to look at the bigger picture and the system as a whole and examine, the interactions between language and other aspects of cognition. Now, also when it comes to the contribution of bio or multilingualism to different aspects of cognition, the field is inherently plagued with a bunch of fundamental questions. For example, who are bilingual children? What are the essential criteria for them to be deemed as bilingual? What are the causes behind them becoming bi or multilingual? And what is the minimum level of proficiency in both or more of their languages, basically for them to be categorized as a bilingual? And are there any cognitive consequences for them gaining proficiencies in two or more languages? Now, if you follow this course, sincerely for the last 7 weeks, you will see that we've sort of, had an answer to all of these questions so far. But in today's lecture, I basically don't want to go back and revisit these questions. Let us try and move ahead and see how does bilingualism basically, impact cognitive development and acquisition of literacy and so on. So, despite the challenges that bilingualism and the associated questions bring along, actually few researchers have been able to, venture into these waters. For instance, Lev Vygotsky, who was a Russian psychologist, commented about the possible usefulness of bilingualism in expanding a child's conceptual world. So he says, the child learns to see his language as one particular system among many, to view its phenomena under a more general categories, and this leads to awareness of his linguistic operations. Now, this is interesting because what Vygotsky is talking about is that children, when they know more than one language, are able to actually see the structure of the language from a distance. They are able to look at the patterns in language. They are able to discover, say for example, that there are characteristics of languages that are common across different languages, and those characteristics may not have an all or none kind of view. There are variations between those characteristics and so on and so forth. So the idea is that child would become much more conscious of the linguistic operations, and by virtue of being more conscious of linguistic operations, it become more and more comfortable with using those languages, with respect to other cognitive functions. Also, we've discussed the seminal study of Peel and Lambert several times, and they also, while summarizing their study, actually noted that bilingualism and the use of two languages actually provided their participants, who were young children, if you remember, with a more flexible perspective of looking at the world, and that allowed them to perceive and understand the world in different ways. In other words, it did enhance their cognition generally. So, let us look at some of the abilities which are enhanced by people being bilinguals, and how these abilities may eventually lead into better acquisition of literacy and so on. Let's dive deep in. Now, one of the most obvious advantages of being a bilingual could actually be the domain of metalinguistic awareness that we've discussed in the previous lectures as well. And also it follows from what Vygotsky was saying in the quote that I just mentioned. Now, for instance, we've discussed that when people have two different language systems, it actually allows the children to look at, and appreciate the structural patterns and the systematic features of their language. For example, Tanmar and Myhill actually proposed that fully fluent bilingualism may actually lead to increased metalinguistic awareness and consequently faster reading acquisition and higher academic achievement. So, while we've talked about the first part of the statement already in previous lectures, let us try and see how it sort of leads to faster reading acquisition and higher academic achievement. Now, one of the critical factors in learning to read or acquiring the ability to become literate and eventually achieve highly in your academics is this ability of learning about words. And Leopold suggested that bilingual children actually have a better grasp of characteristics of words and these as a systematic feature of language, which is arbitrariness. So bilingual children actually have a better grasp of the arbitrary relationship between words and their meaning, and that this enables them to have better insights into both of their languages. More specifically, it has been proposed that as bilingual children have a better grasp of what is called referential arbitrariness, that is the function of words, they're actually better at identifying or segmenting words from a speech stream, and therefore follow conversations better, follow instructions better, and so on. However, since the issue of form and meaning are so intertwined with each other, most of the experimental studies have actually looked at them together rather than separately. So it sometimes becomes difficult for us to sort of, tease apart the effects of whether, we're talking about meaning comprehension, or whether we are talking about appreciation of form and understanding the regularities in that respect, and so on. Interestingly, the notion of word form and meaning can be different for different languages. For instance, in Chinese, the notion of word boundaries is rather difficult to define because it is the meaning is actually reflected through this concatenation of characters which are actually arranged around morphemic lines rather than word lines. Similarly, Bialystok in 1986 actually compared monolingual and bilingual first graders' knowledge for word boundaries in French, which was their language which was their school language. Now, these children actually had been studying French for at least 2 years, and the medium of instruction in their schools was also French. These children were trained to count the number of words in a sentence while listening to the sentence and moving a marker to a new pile for each word, and then eventually counting the number of markers. Now, an interesting aspect of this challenge is basically that if children are actually, supposed to do well in this task and they actually want to count the words, they would need to be able to ignore the meaning part, because it is quite possible that when somebody is saying something to you, you would get carried away and you will basically trying to understand them. So you're going to be more engaged in the meaning rather than a form task like counting the words. So, these sentences to these children were actually presented in two conditions. One, where they were presented as normal utterances, where the meaning was as in a canonical form, and other, wherein these sentences were present as scrambled words. So, in this case, it would probably be easier for children to follow the word counts rather than get lost in the meaning of these sentences, get lost in the semantic sense that they are making. Also, the sentences actually varied in the complexity of their constitution. Say, for example, they use monosyllabic words, disyllabic words, and also polysyllabic words. Now, both groups of children actually performed equally well with this scrambled string of words, which is expected because here they don't have the additional burden of comprehending the meaning of these utterances. However, it was apparent that bilingual children were actually much better in isolating the words from meaningful sentences, hence being able to show that they have this ability to ignore the semantic part and just focus on the form part. So it is apparent that while these children were just starting their journey towards bilingualism, because these people have just, these are first graders, early bilinguals, so to speak, mere exposure to another language by means of medium of instruction at school was sufficient to actually enhance their awareness of words and meanings in comparison to their monolingual counterparts. So in a sense, we can see that it is actually, you don't really need to be bilingual from, the time you start acquiring the two languages. Even if you've been in school, say for example, a lot of children actually go to school at around 3.5, 4 years of age, and if they've been in school for 2 years, they are already becoming bilinguals, and the benefits therein of bilingualism are sort of rubbing on to them, and basically they might feed into their academic achievement and word learning capabilities and so on. Also, researchers have explored children's understanding of the nature of reference. Words refer to something. So if I say, if I take a word apple, it refers to the actual fruit, apple. So some researchers have actually tried to look at children's, understanding of the nature of how words refer to certain things in the real world. For example, Cummins in 1978 used 4 different kinds of metalinguistic tasks with monolinguals and bilinguals and reported that bilinguals displayed greater linguistic flexibility when it came to understanding the reference of the word. Say, for example, when I use the word cat, you know that the word cat refers to the object, refers to this animal, cat. But I could also use the term catwalk in reference to the kind of walk models do on the ramp. But catwalk does not have to do with the animal cat's walk at all. So in this sense, children will need to be flexible in order to understand in what reference a particular word has been used. And in this specific capability, bilinguals were found to be much better than their monolingual counterparts. Finally, another illustration of the same comes from Piaget's sun-moon task. For example, here, children were actually asked that if it would be possible to exchange the names of the sun and moon. And if so, what would be up in the sky at night? Say, for example, if you call the sun as moon and if you call the moon as sun, what is going to rise up in the night, or what is going to set by the evening? So if you ask these questions, you will basically, the children, if they need to answer these questions quickly and correctly, they will need to be able to distinguish themselves from the words sun and moon and the references that are, the planetary, the objects, sun and moon, that we're talking about. Another interesting aspect of this task was the final question, which is probably the most difficult, which was, what would the sky look like at night? Now the thing is, if you do the first order task and if you say, okay, it is possible to exchange the names of sun and moon, and maybe you are also able to answer that, okay, the sun will be up at night. Conceptually, you have to create that difference in order to understand it. While I am saying the sun is going to be up at night, I'm actually talking about the moon, and the sky would still look dark. It will not look bright and sunny like if the actual sun in an unexchanged condition was on the top. So there are several studies that have actually used this task from Piaget, and they have actually shown that bilinguals are able to solve this problem earlier than monolinguals in terms of age and also faster. A last study that I would want to mention in terms of word awareness would be Benzie's study, where he actually developed an interesting symbol substitution task to assess children's awareness of the grammatical properties of words. So herein, basically what the children were needed to do was that they needed to substitute the word we with the word spaghetti. Now, and then, the experimenter would ask them, how do you say we are good children? Interestingly here, children actually should say spaghetti are good children. But saying spaghetti are good children also requires that same kind of disengagement between form and meaning that we've been talking about. More importantly, it will also require, some kind of disengagement in terms of understanding that the syntactic rules are also getting violated. So when you say we are good children, you know that R goes with we, but spaghetti, R does not go with spaghetti. Typically, spaghetti. Typically, if you are using the word spaghetti in the beginning of the sentence, you might be using it. That spaghetti is very nice, or spaghetti is my favorite food, something like that. But here, both a disengagement between form and meaning, and also an appreciation about what kind of why the particular word R is being used, because you've made this exchange between we and spaghetti. So Benzie actually found that bilingual children were significantly better and more reliable at performing this task, whereas their monolingual counterparts could not easily separate themselves with the meanings of individual words, we and spaghetti. And thus, they actually found it very difficult to, make this requested substitution. So, we saw that word awareness is a critical skill in acquiring the ability to read and eventually become literate and have higher academic achievement. And you can see here that almost certainly bilinguals have a bit of an edge over their monolingual counterparts in this ability. Again, remember that I'm not really implying that monolinguals are poor at this or in any which way. Basically, on comparison, we are actually talking about, let's say, bilinguals being relatively better in this aspect of metalinguistic awareness than monolinguals. Moving on to syntactic awareness. Now, obviously, when you're talking about words or language, syntax is one of the prominent characteristics of language, and it also forms part of the metalinguistic awareness that we are actually talking about. So, some prominent metalinguistic tasks have actually looked at the grammaticality judgment task as one of the tools to judge children on their sense of syntactic awareness. In one of the studies, for example, Galambos and Hakuta in 1988 compared monolingual and bilingual children in their ability to correct the syntactic structure of sentences, and then in a different task, they were actually asked to determine what was the ambiguity in these sentences and then paraphrase the various versions of the same. As this was a longitudinal study, the authors actually found a consistent advantage for bilinguals over monolinguals in the first task from the beginning, but no advantage was found in interpreting ambiguity. The advantage in interpreting ambiguity only emerged slightly later when the bilinguals were also slightly more aged. So this tells us that bilingual children might be better in pointing out these errors, but they were not very good at sort of understanding or explaining why these errors would have been, or what are the aspects of ambiguity that are there, and explaining them. Another study that we could talk about was conducted by Golden Meadow in 1990, who presented monolinguals and bilinguals with a variety of problems to check for their syntactic awareness that included detecting, correcting, and explaining errors. Explaining errors is very similar to the explaining ambiguity version of the task that we were just talking about. Now, interestingly here, they found a bilingual advantage for noting and correcting errors at all ages, but they couldn't find any group differences for explaining these errors. So there were three parts: detecting, correcting, and explaining errors. For detecting and correcting, they were a bilingual advantage, but not for explaining errors. So the authors actually interpreted these findings as illustrating, in some sense, the developmental progression of moving from a content-based to a structure-based appreciation of languages, and found that bilinguals had a degree of advantage over monolinguals across all three stages. However, it's not always that bilinguals, outperform monolinguals in all aspects of syntactic awareness as well. For instance, there are also tasks like Gathercole in 1997, where, she used a grammaticality judgment task to test for whether Spanish-English bilingual children could actually use syntactic cues to distinguish between mass nouns like water, porridge, etc., from count nouns like cups, bottles, keys, etc. Now, she reported that while older and more fluent bilinguals could actually utilize syntactic cues from these utterances like monolinguals, the younger and weaker bilinguals were not being able to pay attention to those things. More importantly, in another study, Gathercole and Montes actually, in their task, monolinguals actually outperformed the Spanish-English bilinguals on a grammaticality judgment task, wherein the participants had to judge and correct sentences. So the authors actually noted that the bilinguals' performance was moderated in some sense by the amount of English input they had to read. How well did they know their second language? All in all, Bialystok actually reasoned that bilinguals do not consistently outperform monolinguals on syntactic awareness tasks using, let's say, the grammaticality judgment as one of the major tasks. And when they do, it is typically when the task involves some kind of distracting information such as anomalous meanings, etc. And they are better at pointing and correcting errors, but not really in explaining them. So they're probably not understanding the whole depth of it as well as the monolinguals are doing. And this is also something that Galambos and Hakuta, actually mentioned in their explanation, that there was no advantage for bilinguals as compared to monolinguals when the task actually involved analysis and explanation of linguistic structure. Moving to phonological awareness, which is also a very important aspect of, metalinguistic awareness. It is basically, so some studies have also been conducted in the domain of phonological awareness. For example, studies by Carlyle and colleagues and Durgunoglu and colleagues, who have actually shown that the levels of phonological awareness are actually able to predict the levels of reading acquisition in each of the languages of bilingual children. However, very few studies have actually looked at the development of phonological awareness in bilingual children. Let's look at some experiments here. So, Rubin and Turner actually sought to compare the phonological awareness of English speaking first grade children who were either part of French immersion or English educational programs, and actually found an advantage for the French immersion children. Similarly, Brooke and Genesee compared monolinguals and initial state bilinguals longitudinally from kindergarten to first grade on a range of tasks. Now, these children were actually English speaking children who were studying in French medium schools. And an advantage that was reported for the children in the French school was in onset rhyme segmentation in kindergarten, which then disappeared in later grades. So, grade 1, grade 2, it sort of goes away. Why is this happening? This is probably happening because French is priming these individuals for syllable counting. They are for syllable counting because of their immersion in the French school and the structure of French phonology, which makes it possible for the syllables to become more salient and definitely more salient than English, and children to sort of discover them and make these decisions. Now, the monolingual advantage of phoneme counting was attributed to differences in instruction in English as compared to French. So, indeed, these findings actually show that factors such as language structure and literacy acquisition are ultimately more important in bilingualism than bilingualism in explaining children's level of metalinguistic awareness in this domain. So we've seen that for word awareness, bilingual children are very good. For syntactic, I'm not sure the evidence was that strong, and for phonological as well. In phonological awareness, an interesting insight comes out that children are very, very sensitive to the way they have been taught in school, the way emphasis has been placed in school on certain aspects of reading and so on. So even more than bilingualism, the manner of instruction and the emphasis in instruction is a critical factor when we are actually talking about comparing bilingual and monolingual children on these different aspects of metalinguistic awareness. So, if you examine children with limited exposure to bilingualism, for example, Yellen and colleagues did this, and they asked children to judge whether pictured objects had long or short names. So, they are showing them object pictures and they are asking that, whether this object will have a longer name or shorter name. They reported it an advantage for bilingual children in kindergarten, but then again that disappeared by grade first. Also, Campbell and Sayce, who were working with the Italian English preschool bilinguals, and were reasonably, these bilinguals were reasonably competent in both languages and assessed their phonological awareness across 4 tasks. So, Campbell and Sayce actually reported that the bilingual children were better than monolinguals on the phonological tasks, but not so much on letter monitoring. Ideally, you would expect an advantage in letter monitoring as well, because it would need the same kind of disengagement from form and meaning, but again, the results are not very strong on that side. So these studies and a range of later studies, too showed that awareness in phonological, the skills in phonological awareness come to bilinguals only in very early stages, but disappear with age and as they are progressing through grades. So these results have been actually attributed to more robust effects of instruction and learning to read rather than the peculiarities of different writing systems. So the idea is that how are children being instructed to pay attention on what aspects of language actually is a much more important aspect rather than them being bilingual or monolingual. Moving on, as I was saying, we were talking about metalinguistic awareness, syntactic awareness, phonological awareness, and word awareness. But eventually, what do we want to talk about? Eventually, we want to talk about how these abilities sort of come together and contribute towards literacy acquisition, which is a key skill in today's world. And for any kid to have a bright future and better job prospects in life, acquisition of literacy is one of the very critical and important skills. So, learning to read actually, if you're talking about learning to read, it builds upon a set of prerequisite skills, some of which include this metalinguistic skills that we've talked about, but there are other skills as well, which basically include, say, for example, mastery of the discourse structure of the stories and also understanding of the nuances of these, separate writing systems. The second part I will talk to you about in more detail in the next lecture as well. So researchers have actually looked at the development of the latter in bilingual children, and a very important aspect, if you sort of look at it, a very important aspect for bilingual children is to get immersed in a culture of stories, which requires them to become familiar with conventions in discourse and text that would bring sort of some kind of cohesion and refinement in the text being read. So the idea is, when you're teaching children to learn to read, you will basically expect them to gather these skills and expect them to use these skills in order to get better in learning to read and comprehending the overall text and so on. So they need to sort of one of the best ways of imparting the ability to read is for children to read these stories and become aware of them, because there are very nuanced semantic aspects as well as aspects of orthography also involved. So, learning to read does not directly follow from competence in oral speech. This is also something that needs to be pointed out. Oral speech, basically, you may be very good in speaking or expressing yourself in the oral manner, but it is difficult for people, or say, for example, it is a fundamental skill, which is a fundamentally different skill to be able to learn to read, which requires, developing an understanding of the script and its conventions. And learning to read therefore develops very gradually from children's experiences with these storybooks, and their level of mastery, that gradually develops. Interestingly, people have shown that this mastery actually has been able to predict successful literary outcomes for these children. Now, a range of studies examining these abilities in bilingual children have shown that competence in these purely literate forms of discourse in their two languages is largely shared across a bilingual's both languages. For instance, skills that require children to provide formal definitions or picture descriptions or understandings of metaphors are actually at equivalent level across the bilinguals both languages, although more interactive skills like conversational skills develop individually for the separate languages. Say, for example, if you interact more in Hindi, you will be better in interacting in Hindi. If you interact more in English, you'll interact more in English. But your general skill of, if you have acquired a general skill of, or if you've cracked the system of how to read and how to interpret discourse or text conventions, that would sort of be shared across the two languages. Also, for instance, say, for example, in a cross-linguistic research enterprise, Wu and colleagues demonstrated that children were able to learn the decontextualized skills with oral and written picture descriptions, and it reflected the emphasis of their school curriculum, with some being better in written, whereas others being better in oral mode. Something that we were seeing with syntactic awareness as well as phonological awareness studies, that the manner in which the school imparts education, the manner in which the school plays emphasis on certain aspects of reading acquisition is actually a very, very critical factor here. So Wu and colleagues actually concluded that second language learners must have direct experience in the target language consistent with the discourse demands of a given task, and if they were to be able to carry out these tasks equally well in both languages. Moving on, before children learn to read independently, they also must be able to acquire concepts that allow them to understand the writing system of a given language, and how is the same used to convey meaning from print. So consequently, researchers have asked whether monolingual and bilingual children who are exposed to writing systems of two different languages acquire these skills in different ways or in the same manner. Across several studies, however, it has been reported that bilingual children outperform monolingual children on, say, for example, the moving word task that we were talking about, which requires children to track the relationship between text and meaning, which we've already seen so far. Moreover, there have also been a range of studies that are explicitly trying to investigate the children's ability of learning to read in a second language and the consequences of their exposure to two different writing systems. Some of them have actually shown that bilinguals benefit from exposure to different writing systems since an early age. Also, a bunch of studies have shown that there are huge transfer effects in the ability of learning to read between the two different languages, between the two writing systems of different languages. But these transfer effects are more if the two writing systems are similar. Say, for example, if both are alphabetic or both are syllabic. Bialystok, for example, in this same respect, comments that it seems that bilingual children learn to read, in one of their languages, and that helps them become literate in both their languages. Obviously, with the caveat of the similarity between the writing systems. So, overall, if you want to summarize this, it seems that bilingualism does have some consequences for the development of literacy in children, although the exact nature of these consequences depends actually upon a range of factors such as similarity between language structure, their writing systems, as well as school instructions, etc. These factors are also certainly moderated by the overall exposure of these children to different environments and at their schools and homes. So that's all that I wanted to share with you in this particular lecture. I'll see you in the next one very shortly. Thank you so much.